History is usually written by the winners, but the losers sometimes take up even more space in our memories. Because some losers turn their fate into a legend that will never be forgotten. Think about it. A major war, a critical assault, and thousands of soldiers are retreating. Yet a few of them remain standing and continue to resist. They say, there is no turning back, and they actually manage to fulfill that promise. And in that moment, they become legends. Today, we're going to talk about such moments. I will tell you 3 stories, all of them real. In 1915, while the awful days of World War I continued, dead men were literally rising through clouds of gas. In 1566, a small number of soldiers inside a single fortress wrote their final chapter against the strongest army the world had seen. And in 1897, just 21 soldiers managed to hold off a crowd of 10,000 for hours. In short, today we are diving into the most epic last stands in history. These stories aren't just about brave men, they're about stubbornness, fear, courage, and sometimes the ability to say, even if I vanish, I will not give up. So, let's begin. Sometimes in history, there are moments when the word impossible means absolutely nothing. The year is 1915. World War I was devastating Europe, and humanity was learning, in the harshest way possible, just how deadly modern weapons could be. Death had become industrialized, used brutally from artillery wagons to machine guns. On the Eastern Front, a small but strategic fortress called Osowiec was held by the Russian army. The German army had been trying to capture this fortress for an entire year, but they simply couldn't break the Russian defense. The 900-man garrison was small but stubborn. The Germans had nearly 10 times their numbers, yet the Russians stood firm. On the morning of August 6th, something changed. The wind shifted, and everything suddenly turned in Germany's favor. Around 4 in the morning, when the sounds of German artillery began, the Russians assumed it was just another daily bombardment. But this time, after the shells, a greenish mist slipped into the trenches. As Russian soldiers tried to understand what it was, their eyes began to burn. They couldn't breathe. Then most of them collapsed, blood coming from their eyes and noses. The Germans had used chlorine gas, and nobody had gas masks. Within minutes, the fortress fell into a deadly silence. Exactly an hour later, German soldiers entered the fortress with gas masks on. Everyone was lying on the ground, and naturally they assumed the Russians were dead. Then from behind the ramparts they heard growls, then a few coughing sounds, and out of the shadows a few men stood up. Men who should have been killed instantly by the gas were approaching, their faces covered in blood, rifles still in their hands, bayonets fixed forward. They were struggling to breathe, but they were still ready to fight. They should have been dead. But they stood up and launched an attack. It was an inhuman assault, so surreal it made German soldiers drop their rifles out of terror. The Germans were forced to retreat. The fortress was still standing. The Russian soldiers who survived the Germans' inhuman attack didn't live much longer, but they fought until their final breaths, and with their legendary resistance, they carved their names into history. The Ottoman Empire was at the peak of its power. Its banners were waving from west to east, and the map of Europe was changing once again with every move they made. The year was 1566. Suleiman the Magnificent, who had ruled the empire for exactly 46 years, was now an old man, but his only desire was to keep winning wars. His target was once again Vienna, right in the heart of Europe. As the army marched toward its destination, they encountered a small but equally stubborn fortress, Szigetvár. But this place was more than just a stone fortress. because its commander was the Croatian Count Nikola Zrinski, who had been a thorn in the Ottoman side for years. He had halted the Ottoman advance toward Vienna several times before. Suleiman knew this name and knew his abilities. The Ottoman army consisted of 100,000 men, but there were only 2,300 soldiers defending the fortress, most of them Hungarian and Croatian volunteers. However, the fortress had a slightly unusual architectural structure. It consisted of three parts: the old, the new, and the inner castle, each connected by bridges. Zrinski's plan was simple. As the Ottomans advanced, he would withdraw to the next section and resist to the end, no matter the cost. On August 6, 1566, the first Ottoman assault began. The first target was the new castle. The ground and sky were engulfed in smoke from cannon fire, yet an unexpected miracle happened. The defenders managed to repel the Ottomans' first attack. But this miracle didn't last long, and 3 days later, the castle fell. The same day, Suleiman the Magnificent arrived at the front line himself and took command of his army. The next target was the old castle. Attacks continued for days. The Croatian and Hungarian volunteers did more than anyone could ask of them. But on August 19th, the old castle also fell into Ottoman hands. The remaining 600 defenders withdrew to their last refuge, the inner castle. The Sultan sent envoys to the fortress. He must have admired Zrinski's resistance, because he offered him rulership over all of Croatia in exchange for surrender. But no answer came from the fortress, neither positive nor negative. They had almost severed all ties with life, withdrawing deep into the castle. The Ottomans even threw letters over the walls, promising to spare the life of every defender if they surrendered. But again, no reply came. The bombardments continued without pause, and the fortress now had almost no wall left standing. The defenders had limited weapons, no water, and no food. Yet clearly, luck had not completely abandoned them. A contagious disease spreading from the swamps surrounding the fortress struck the Ottoman camp. From the lowest-ranking soldiers to the commanders, many were infected by this mysterious sickness. Some say Suleiman the Magnificent died from this illness, though according to reliable sources, he died on September 6, 1566, from gout, a disease he had suffered from for years. Worried that the soldiers' morale would collapse, the commanders kept his death secret for a while. Zrinski, of course, knew nothing of what had happened. The next day, the Ottoman army launched yet another assault. This time, they tried a different form of attack and targeted the gunpowder magazine beneath the fortress using the Ottoman Humbaracha troops, one of the earliest military mortar units in history. Amidst the dust, smoke, and flames, Zrinski and his men began resisting one last time. They had nowhere left to retreat. Only death stood before them, and they wanted that death to be honorable. And so it was. Even after Zrinski collapsed to the ground, his men gathered around him and continued fighting. In the end, Szigetvár fell, but Zrinski's name was never forgotten. And with the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, the rise of the Ottoman Empire came to an end. The mountainous frontier region in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent had never known what peace felt like. Since ancient times, conflicts and divisions had never ceased there. The year was 1897. The army made up of British and Indian soldiers was trying to stop and suppress the relentless attacks of the Afghan tribes in the area. Fortresses had been built along the frontier, and security was being maintained as best as possible. Between two of these fortresses, Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, there was a small outpost responsible for maintaining communication between them. No one could have known that Saragarhi outpost, a spot that seemed like an insignificant waypoint, would become the stage for a resistance that would change the course of history. Only 21 Sikh soldiers were stationed at the outpost, all serving under the British Army. Their only duty was long stretches of waiting, which made serving there monotonous and dull. But on the morning of September 12th, a cloud of dust appeared in the distance, and hidden within that dust were 10,000 Afghan warriors advancing towards Saragarhi. The soldier on duty in the signal tower immediately reported the situation to their commanders at Fort Lockhart. They were under attack and urgently needed help, but the reply they received marked the end of their uneventful days. The soldiers at the fort were away on assignment, and it was impossible for them to return in time. No help would be coming. The 21 soldiers fell silent. They understood the truth. No reinforcements meant they would all die. But if they died resisting, they could protect the forts they were connected to and buy them the time needed for reinforcements to arrive. Once they realized they all shared the same decision, they quickly checked their ammunition and took positions in the trenches. Their commander, Havildar Ishar Singh, stood bravely among his men. By 9 a.m., the distant dust cloud had reached the outpost. Armed men from the Afghan tribes were approaching the walls while shouting terrifying war cries. But the Sikh soldiers were positioned on the high ground of the outpost and managed to stop the first wave. Yet the waves kept coming. There were only 21 of them, and every loss was a heavy blow. One by one they began to fall, but even so, they did not retreat. Even knowing they would die soon, they used whatever strength they had left to bring down the attackers. Unable to seize the outpost entirely and realizing it wouldn't be easy, the Afghan tribal leaders sent messages inside, offering money and protection. But the Sikh soldiers responded with gunfire. This time, the attackers tried another method. They set the dry grass around the outpost on fire. In an instant, the entire place was engulfed in smoke. Neither side could see the other. At that moment, Afghan warriors were spotted infiltrating the signal tower. That position had weakened, but it had to be defended. Commander Ishar Singh sent a few men to hold the tower. This left the front more vulnerable. Soon the stone walls collapsed, and hundreds of armed Afghan tribesmen poured into the outpost. Meanwhile, the ammunition of the defenders was running low. From that point on, it would come down to bayonets and fists. Fierce hand-to-hand combat broke out within the trenches. The outpost was rapidly falling to the attackers. Ishar Singh ordered the few remaining soldiers to fall back into the inner courtyard. He himself stepped behind the front gate, fixed his bayonet, and charged into the enemy, hoping to buy even a few seconds for his men. With his death, the last defenders managed to regroup for a brief moment. But there was no plan left to make. Almost no one had ammunition. They fixed their bayonets and clenched their fists, but even then, they could not hold out for long. The final line of resistance was broken, and the outpost fell into Afghan hands. Only one Sikh soldier remained. He was the one assigned to defend the signal tower by the commander's order. Loyal to his task, he waited by the communication device. His last request, sent by Morse code to the commanders at Fort Lockhart, was simple. He wanted to pick up his rifle and resist until the very end. The officers watching the battle through binoculars from afar, unable to help in any way, sent him their approval. The soldier quietly shut off the device, loaded his rifle, prepared his ammunition, and took position at the tower window. That day, he brought down around 40 warriors by himself. But he no longer had ammunition to continue. The Afghans had set the tower on fire, and the thick black smoke made it impossible to see or aim. Eventually, silence settled over the scene. The defense of Saragarhi had lasted around 6 hours. Only 21 soldiers had managed to halt tens of thousands of Afghan warriors and buy precious time for the troops behind them. None of them survived, But the reinforcements that arrived the next day secured both forts and drove back the tribal assault. Havildar Ishar Singh and his brave Sikh soldiers were posthumously awarded the Indian Order of Merit, the highest honor a native soldier could receive. Yes, today we took a brief journey into the stories of people who managed to rise even in history's most hopeless moments. And we saw that sometimes the fate of a war is not determined by massive armies, but by a small handful of people who refuse to take a single step back until their final breath. Some walked through clouds of poisonous gas. Some stood among the stones of destroyed fortresses. Some held their ground alone at the top of a tower. But they all shared something in common. Even when everyone said, "It's over," they did not give up. What we told in this video is only a small selection from the hundreds of resistances hidden on the dusty shelves of history. If you're curious about history's dark, yet deeply inspiring tall side, then our journey has only just begun. We have much more to discover together. If you've watched this far, truly thank you. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next stories. And don't forget to write in the comments, which of today's resistances affected you the most? I'll be reading all of them. In the next video, we'll continue exploring history's dark, glorious, and often forgotten tales. Take care, farewell, and never lose your curiosity.